Implicit biases impact the largest minority in the United States when we talk about equity, diversity, and inclusiveness. People with disabilities are nearly 20% or 1 in 5 of our friends, families, colleagues, and others. The intent of this webinar is to broaden your perceptions on how those often unrecognized personal, organizational, cultural, and educational predispositions affect the lives of people with disabilities. The work of our guests have improved the lives of literally millions of people with disabilities globally and here in the United States. Each of our guests have positively impacted the very definition and nature of accessibility itself and the tangible architectural content of accessible designs, codes, and standards. I'm honored to introduce our 3 guests alphabetically, and I want to thank them for giving of their valuable time today. Our first guest is Lex Frieden, Professor of Biomedical Informatics and Professor of Physical Medicine at the Rehabilitation at University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. He is an adjunct professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation at Baylor College of Medicine. Mr. Frieden holds a master's degree in social psychology from the University of Houston and has been awarded a World Rehabilitation Fund Fellowship to study programs for disabled persons in Europe. Mr. Frieden was appointed by President George W. Bush and confirmed by the U.S. Senate as chairperson of the National Council on Disability. The council is charged with making recommendations on disability policy to the president and Congress, and he has received 2 presidential citations for his work in the field of disabilities. He served as executive director of the National Council of the Handicapped, now Council on Disabilities, and was instrumental in conceiving and drafting the Americans with Disabilities Act. He was on the dais with President Bush at the signing of that act. For 8 years, Mr. Frieden served on the United Nations panel of experts on the standard rules for disability, and he's past president of Rehabilitation International, a federation of 200 national and international organizations in 90 countries working for persons with disabilities and their families. Mr. Frieden is a quadriplegic due to a spinal cord injury and has been involved in the organization of several groups, disabled individuals, including the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, the Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, and the Houston Coalition for Barrier-Free Living. Our next guest is Robin Jones, the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center and an instructor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. The center serves the states of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. The center provides training, technical assistance, and other duties on the Americans with Disabilities Act and accessible information technologies. Robin has served as the director of the center since its inception in 1991, and formerly she served as director of an independent living center and an occupational therapy practitioner at the Rehab Institute in Chicago. She has extensive experience as a trainer regarding the ADA for business, government, and disability organizations, and Robin is actively involved in assisting businesses and governments to meet their obligations under the ADA and is nationally recognized as a key resource regarding ADA compliance. And our next panelist is Marsha Mazz, who joined the staff of the United Spinal Association as the Director of Accessibility Codes and Standards in September of 2018. Before joining United Spinal, Marsha directed the Federal United States Access Board's Office of Technical and Information Services, which is responsible for the development and maintenance of the Access Board's accessibility guidelines and standards, often called the ADAG, as well as the Access Board's training and technical assistance programs. Her career has been focused on bringing accessibility into the mainstream of society through outreach and coordination with the model building codes community. In recognition of her work on the Access Board, Marsha Mazz received the prestigious American National Standards Institute Ronald H. Brown Standard Leadership Award, recognizing demonstrated leadership in promoting standardization and eliminating barriers to global trade. And finally, our moderator is Ricardo A. Leon. Ricardo was born and raised in Dallas, Texas, and is a designer at Baldridge Architects based in Austin, Texas, pardon me. He received a Master of Architecture from Columbia University, Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and a Bachelor of Science in Architecture with a minor in Architectural History from the University of Texas at Arlington, where he teaches design and drawing studios as an adjunct professor. Ricardo is also a disability advocate and an active member of the Texas Society of Architects EDI committee. Now let's go to Ricardo and our guests and get started.
Thank you, Richard. And to our panelists, I'm very honored and really excited to have you all here to contribute to this discussion and hear from your expertise. As Richard mentioned, we'll be talking about a number of topics today, all related to accessibility and advocacy and disability justice, including implicit bias, ADA accessibility standards and their evolution in the built environment, education for education of code for students and architects today, inclusive and universal design, and allyship and beyond. I'm really honored to have you all here today. So questions are going to be intended for everyone, but I might call on one particular person to just sort of kick off the discussion for each. So with that being said, Robin, let's start with you to kick off this first question. We begin with how do you define implicit bias, and how do you see this play a role in the state of accessibility in architecture?
Sorry, I wasn't. I know. Yeah. So, implicit bias, obviously a lot of discussion, a lot of happening now around this and in society in general, around a lot of things. As we look at the disability community, we look at other marginalized communities and such of that nature. When I look at this as a issue for the architecture design community, and I look at implicit bias, to me that is the biases or what we bring to the table, or individuals come to the table with in regards to what they have experienced or not experienced, and what they put on to the work that they're doing. Specifically, when I talk about disability, implicit biases be that issue of what we think we know about disability or not know about disability, and how we feel about that, as it influences our design. So are we supportive of it? Are we not supportive of it? Is it how does that influence our approach? Are we looking at accessibility as an obligation, a legal requirement, or are we looking at accessibility as something that we understand it benefits everybody? And so how does that influence, and how does that bias reflect then in our designs and the work that we do? Do we look at things as minimums, versus can we, going beyond? And I think that's just something that we come into it with, depending on our background and our, our exposure, our understanding, and then how that carries over, whether we realize it does or not. I mean, sometimes when I'm working with architects and designers and talking to them about accessibility, there's often this blankness that kind of takes over when I start talking about how people use spaces, how and why there are specific requirements, why something needs to be certain width or a certain length, or a barrier needs to be not there, or needs to be addressed, and not in the context of only one, but why does not every entrance accessible, or not, every walkway, well, I've provided them with a accessible entrance. That's like, well, you implying that people with disabilities only need one entrance, but everybody without a disability, there's 3 other ones that they can use, and but as long as there's one, for somebody with a disability, that's enough. That just is something that is I look at, or I see, is how that gets applied in the design world. Is it where people are coming from, their lack of understanding, and how that then goes over into their designs, or their choices that they make in those designs.
Absolutely. Marsha, your thoughts on the same question?
Thank you, Ricardo. To me, implicit design is a failure to regard people with disabilities as quote unquote normal building occupants. I think that there is still a sense that people with disabilities are in the other category. They're not to be anticipated, they're not to be planned for, they're not to be included in an architect's analysis of who this building is for and why it's being constructed the way it's being constructed. And frankly, I think that architects who are better at understanding their building occupants and better at building buildings for people are usually less encumbered by bias than architects who are focused on the aesthetics of the building. But I see no reason why you can't have both. You can't both be aesthetically pleasing and usable by all occupants. I don't regard it as an issue of numbers versus, how many of us are there, how many of others are there, how many people with disabilities. I think that if even just one person with a disability is excluded by the design, then the design has failed the building occupant test. Thank you.
Thank you. And Lex, your thoughts on the same question as well?
I think Marsha and Robin have covered it pretty well. Frankly, I'm not sure there is an implicit bias. I think there's an ignorance, and I choose to think of architects and others who refuse to accept the reality that disability is a part of nature. It's a part of our society, and in order for our society to be functional, people with disabilities have to be fully engaged and full participants. And those who do not acknowledge that are simply ignorant.
Absolutely, Lex. And, Robin, you were talking about this idea of, implicit bias having a relationship to minimums. And many architects and clients still struggle with designing not only to meet ADA standards, but to design inclusively. So how do we change this in education and in practice and encourage architects and students from the early stages of learning about architecture to design beyond, as you mentioned, those minimum accessibility requirements?
Well, I mean, in my ideal world, I would love to see, some set curriculum that is, required for architecture and design programs, some, minimum standard. But I think one of the best ways, and I try to encourage when I do have an opportunity to interface with educators in this world is, are you, exploring and having people from the community, people who are users of space, who are users of features and things like that, engaging with your students, and are your students engaging with them, through, experiential learning. I just, feel that experiential learning is just, got so much value, and it, you can talk about the codes, you can use PowerPoint, you can show me what it says, and you can show me the code books and, whatever, but actually going and, with individuals into the community who are users of a variety of different mobility devices, who are users and who have, vision, hearing, and other kinds of disabilities that may interface, impact how they interface with the environment, and really seeing how the barriers that are out there do exist for people, even when the community is quote unquote designed accessible. Because when you see somebody who's actually using a 1 in 12 ramp, for example, who's a manual wheelchair user, and I'll use it, example, I did this on my own campus, is that we have an elevated station, a train station on our campus, that they were replacing remodeling it. And so the big debate was, would they put in an elevator or would they put in a ramp? And the station is like way above the highway. I don't remember the dimensions of it right now, but it's quite a distance. And so the ramp was significant. Actually, the ramp, in order to be accessible, because you couldn't do a lot of switchbacks or anything, just lengthwise had to be over a block long, if they were to, construct that. And we had, we used it as an example in a discussion about, yes, you can put in that ramp, and that would be compliant, to provide somebody a ramp to get to the train track. But the amount of effort and the amount of energy and stuff that it needs for somebody to have to travel that extra block that nobody else has to do, to get to that train station. Of course, anybody can use the ramp, but the stairs being next door, am I going to walk the block or am I going to use the ramp? Largely, a lot of people are obviously going to choose to use the stairs, except those who couldn't. So that was, talking about that and really illustrating that, yeah, the ramp was compliant. You would meet your requirements, but the elevator would give somebody direct access, versus, use of the ramp. And we just used that as an example when we were, and we actually had, because we have something similar nearby, and we had some students go out and actually try using a wheelchair, using that block, type ramp situation, and traveling a block, versus an elevator. So they really could understand why that design, and how that needed to be taken into consideration, those kinds of things. So I think that kind of learning is really critical to really engage and talk to people who are really actually impacted by the design that you use, who are users of the features that you do, to understand what an accessible bathroom, that is just a little bit off, or how that impacts somebody, so that you can really, you're never going to be able to be in the shoes of, or in the, I'm not a big proponent of the, put somebody in a wheelchair and have them, mimic what, somebody does for a day, kind of a thing or anything like that as a tool. But I think partnering them with people with disabilities who have and use different mobility devices, or have different limitations that are impacted by how the community or the environment is designed, so that they can experience what those people experience, and understand the usability, because there's just a huge difference between the design and then the usability of those elements.
Couldn't agree more. And as a wheelchair user, I share that anecdote of having to go and traverse a long way just to get to the entrance that is, a few steps up, but the ramp to get there, as the usability of it is just cumbersome and difficult.
Just even the additional time it takes, it's not, when I have to allow additional time to be able to traverse that ramp, where, somebody who, if I was using an elevator, cut down, 15, 20 minutes. So, yeah.
Of course. Marsha or Lex?
Yeah.
Sure. Sorry, Lex, you go ahead.
Yeah, if I can, I maybe use this as an object lesson. I kind of have an issue with people who are not mobility impaired having multiple ways of accessing a facility, and those of us who are mobility impaired having a single route. And I can say that, having been stuck in an elevator for 8 hours, having been stuck waiting on an elevator for 3 hours on multiple occasions, there needs to be an alternative route, an alternative access, alternative way. I don't want to call the fire department to come and take me off the top of that bus, stop, simply because the elevator is not working, and the contract that the provider has requires them to be there within 3 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, or 24, depending on where you are. And that concerns me. I don't know if your students considered a switchback ramp, which would take much less than a block to build and have stops on it for people to rest if they needed to. I don't know if the students considered what they would do for everyone if steps were not allowed, and what kind of resources they would have to back up the elevator. So I think we really need to extend our thoughts and consider, in this case, safety issues. And I'm a proponent of having always a way to escape, an escape route, and I think that ought to be part of the planning process, as a matter of fact. So that's my 2 cents.
Well, let me just interject that there is not space for a switchback. They're very limited real estate with the train tracks. So I don't disagree with the issue of the safety of the elevator at all. Sorry if I brought that as an example, raised a whole other issue.
So Lex, I think you are pointing out something that's incredibly important. Architects are natural problem solvers. And by providing them a set of standards by which they, have to comply, either you comply or you don't comply, and if you don't comply, you're a discriminator. We, in some cases, in some ways, do them a disservice. And they'll just have to get over that, because that is the standards are the law. But as Robin pointed out earlier, standards are minimums. And it's what you need to do minimally to get by. And if we can encourage the profession, especially young architects and architects who are just beginning to learn, to really use those problem-solving skills that they have to figure out how to design for equity, how to design for inclusion, I think we would be doing them a huge favor, and architecture would be far less of a problem for people with disabilities. And we talked about, and you talked about putting someone in a wheelchair and the drawbacks of that. And I agree totally with Robin that pairing people with someone with a disability makes much more sense. Because if you put somebody in a wheelchair and you launch them out onto campus and say, okay, go buy a Coke or go do this, go do that, they're going to encounter all kinds of problems. They're going to encounter problems that a proficient wheelchair user who knows how to maneuver their chair and is in control of their chair may not encounter. And they may very well come back thinking, if I were a wheelchair user, I'd just give up. Or I think everybody now who uses a wheelchair must be a superhuman. And those are not what we want people to think, because if that's what people think, then once again, they're tossing people with disabilities into that other category, not normal building occupant category. And so when we talk, for example, about the fact that most people with disabilities who use wheelchairs can't reach past their toes, I can tell you that, I can tell a student that, and they can probably memorize it. But if I talk to that student and say, okay, now lift your feet off the floor so you can't brace against the floor, and lean forward in your chair and tell me what muscles you're using and where, and when you feel tippy, they learn something. They learn that there's a reason why people can't reach very far past their toes if they're sitting in a wheelchair. They learn that there's a reason someone throws their hand over the back of the chair or their arm over the back of the chair when they lean forward. And that can inform a lot of decisions about how they locate things to make them reachable. If you pay attention to the information that's provided from an organization called Deaf Space, you would learn very quickly that when people who are deaf are walking and talking, they need a wider path of travel. They need that wider path of travel because as they're engaging with one another, one person takes the job of lookout while they're listening, if you will, or while they're talking, sorry, and the other person takes the job of listener. And then those roles switch. And the research that's been done on this subject is absolutely fascinating. And when you pay attention to it and when you study that research and you talk to deaf people, you understand why these spaces have to be bigger for someone who's deaf. In fact, sometimes a little bigger than maybe is necessary for a single person in a wheelchair with a companion who's walking alongside them. So there's a lot to learn, and I think that architects are uniquely qualified to learn these things and to then apply them. I don't think there's anybody much better than architects at this. Thank you.
Absolutely, Marsha. And, you bring up a point about, the way that architects, think and problem solve. And, in architecture education, we are taught to work against, constraints like what's the context, what's the site, what have you. And so hopefully this idea of how to create spaces that are a lot more inclusive is part of that mindset of it's just something that you just need to assume is going to be a part of your project in the same way that any other constraint would be. It's not just an additive process. I have a question that maybe you can kind of start off. So since the passage of the ADA in 1990, the built environment has been significantly shaped and changed to better address the needs of a large and growing population. What are some significant points of discussion that you're seeing come up today that are informing your own work and that you hope to see in future iterations of accessibility standards and building code?
Well, it's a good question, and clearly ADA has transformed the physical environment, and it has had a huge impact. My students today, most of them were born after the ADA, and it's hard for them to imagine. They simply cannot imagine how life must have been before the ADA. And frankly, it's been so long that I sometimes have difficulty remembering how it was. And then again, from time to time, I have a flashback when I wind up in a place that I can't get to where I need to be because of architectural barriers. And so we clearly have a ways to go. And I don't think that when we worked on the ADA, we expected it to change overnight. And I don't think we expected it to change in 10 years or 20 or 30. I think we expected it to have an impact on building and design going forward. And what's disappointing to me is that we continue, despite the fact that the ADA is so many years old, we still have trouble ensuring that all new places are accessible and ensuring that anytime somebody changes a building or a facility, that it's not made accessible. This is really annoying and frustrating. And Marsha made a point a while ago that I think needs to be emphasized, and that is, unfortunately, a lot of design now is built around these standards. The standards are intended to be minimum standards. They're not intended to be examples of good design. And unfortunately, many architects use them as the optimal solution. And worse than that, people who are rebuilding places and doing changes in facilities, these are not architects now, these are building managers and others who take out facilities that are exceeding the standards because they don't meet the standards. If you understand what I mean, 2 weeks ago, one of my favorite restaurants that had a huge, wide, expansive ramp took the ramp out and put in a 3-foot wide ramp. And I said, what's going on here? Well, we didn't meet the standard before. A lawyer sued us because we didn't meet the ADA standard. So we had to take out our big ramp that was so nice looking in front of the cafe and put in this dinky little thing here and put a step next to it for the other people. Can you believe that? I mean, it's just crazy. And here we are still not adapted to a life of barrier-free environments as we expected to be by now. So, you know, we've made great progress, and we're still stumbling.
Absolutely. Robin, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I totally can echo a million times over what Lex said in just regard to this concept of the minimum, and how many conversations I've had, with the bathroom, being at, 60 inches wide, or, 56 inches in depth or whatever. What's wrong with 60 inches of depth? What's wrong with 65 inches of depth? Why do you only look at it, I said, as being that minimum? Can you do more? But the thing that also I think is changing, and I think needs to change and continue to be embraced, is the role that technology can play in increasing accessibility, and making things more accessible. I mean, I think we've seen some of those things, over time, gradually more and more. I think of automatic door openers and, the push button, and now we're seeing the wave, the touchless, the touchless control, because so many of our entities can't use the light, I never come up with the right terminology, but the sensor, light, because it would be too sensitive and be triggered by everything that, blew by, or whatever. So they've, primarily gone to the button type of entry, but that's problematic for a lot of people who can't reach that button, even if it's in the right mounted height, et cetera, because of limitations of hand function or strength or whatever else it might be. And some of the touchless options for that, have really serve a whole host of people, not just a wider range of people with disabilities. But I think even when you look at what technology can do for lighting, and what technology can do for moving things up and down and making them within reach ranges, without it always having to be the issue of mounting it at the minimum or at the maximum or whatever. If you could have that flexibility, because technology allows you to make it adjustable for whoever needs it, to be able to customize that. I think that that's something that hopefully more and more will be embraced. And of course, what happens every time technology comes into play, or anything new comes into play, the question comes and the call comes about, what is the ADA? How does the ADA apply to that? And the standards can't keep up with where technology is at, type of a thing. And even the design right now, we're having a huge debate and issues in our geographic area. I'm sure it's happening in other areas of the country with electric vehicle charging stations. And they're popping up everywhere, and that's new technology with vehicles and cars. And somewhere along the line, somebody decided that people with disabilities aren't going to be driving them, or whatever, because there's been no concern about access to those electric vehicle charging stations. And even though you have guidance provided by the U.S. Access Board, there's not an enforceable standard for that. So it's not identified yet, as enforceable. So you've got tons of stations being created and developed all over the place. And we just had an individual who contacted our office who had purchased an electric vehicle. He had it equipped with hand controls and everything of that nature. And within 3 to 4 months after purchase, he had to sell it because he said it became non-functional because he couldn't use it in the community. He could use it and recharge at home, and such, but he found that he was so limited in where he could go and travel and find accessibility with charging station because he's a wheelchair user and he, has difficulty being able to navigate those charging stations because of the width of them and where things are positioned, and they're up on a curb or whatever, so that he had just ongoing issues. But to think that somebody has to make that choice where I making a choice would be because of its economics or or whatever, but I don't have that same barrier as not having the physical limitation that somebody else does of wanting to be able to do that. And until I've contacted the Department of Justice about it, where are you at with it in regards to this issue, and they're at this point not on their radar for anything, to happen. So we're going to continue to see this. Yes, Department of Transportation, the money that they give, they're going to have obligations to ensure that it's accessible, through the infrastructure bills and things of that nature. But in the day-to-day construction, as condos are being built and they're putting charging stations into the condo parking lots, and stuff, of that nature, and all of these kinds of things. This is just an example. I mean, and so the technologies and things outchase the standards. And there's this mindset that I only have to do what's in the standards. So if electric charging stations aren't in the standards, then, and I'm designing and I'm including electric charging stations, it's not even on my radar that I need to consider the accessibility of those charging stations because it's not in the standard. So it's not in the standard. I don't have to, do it. And I think it's a problem. So technology is going to offer us a lot of opportunities, and it already is, but it also potentially has could potentially hold us back because of the lack of standards of accessibility. And if architects and designers aren't thinking about these things in proactively and saying just because there isn't a standard doesn't mean, there's guidance that I shouldn't be designing to that and including that in my designs and considering accessibility as I incorporate these new technologies and things.
Well, Robin, we are trying to be proactive, and the latest edition of the International Building Code, in fact, does have provisions for EV charging stations, but as is the case, I think maybe there's only 1 or 2 states in the country that are that far ahead in adopting their standards. One of the problems is that, state and local building codes are based on standards that are 6, 9, 12 years old. And there's a new international building code every 3 years. And so as we, encourage people to think about what their responsibilities are, not just under the ADA, but their responsibilities are as people who create the environment for everyone, it would be helpful if people would look forward to issues that are addressed in the building code in more recent editions of the building code. Another thing that we have added to the building code is adult changing stations, requirements for adult changing stations, because you cannot change an 80-year-old on a baby changing table. You cannot change your 16-year-old child with a disability on a baby changing table. So we are now requiring them through the building code, not through the ADA. And as a former employee of the federal government, I can tell you that the federal government is exceptionally slow. And if you really want to look forward, you really need to look to the building codes to do that. They do it more quickly, and they do it every 3 years, which I think is important. This whole question, though, of what is my responsibility if it's not addressed in the building code or it's not addressed in the ADA is something worth exploring, because the Department of Justice, for example, has said in writing that furniture which is not covered by a building code or the ADA standards, is furniture can be designed and laid out in ways that do violate the ADA. And so there is an expectation on the part of the Department of Justice anyway, that you pay attention to your furnishings, your layout to preserve and maintain your accessible routes and your clearances, but also so that that furniture is available to people with disabilities, regardless of whether it's fixed to the building or not. And one of the examples that really just burns up friends of mine who use wheelchairs is the high tables that we're seeing in restaurants all the time. And I think there might have been an effort in Chicago even to address that. I know there was some press in Chicago about the high tables in restaurants. And very recently, my sister, who is only 4'11", and I went to a brand new restaurant, and we asked to sit at low tables, and we were told we could sit at the low tables, but that it was it was happy hour, and you could only get the happy hour prices at the high tables. Now that's clear discrimination, and that you know. As a person who is old enough to feel pain when I climb up into those tall chairs, I you know, very much resented it and spoke to the restaurant, and they eventually did let us sit in the lower seats outside the bar area because all the seats inside the bar area were high tables. So this is something that we're trying to address in the building code as well as through guidance that the Department of Justice has issued on and off again. But these are the things that folks need to think about as they design these facilities and latch on to these trends. I know who we're accommodating when we provide these tall tables. We're accommodating the, you know, the young, vibrant crowds of people who come after work and you know, want to sit for a minute and move around and all that, but there are other people too who want to use the restaurants. And I think it's incumbent on the architect to ask themselves who they're excluding with the design. Thank you.
If I could just jump in for a second on that same comment there, Marsha, this is Robin. You know, other thing I often notice, and sometimes, and I think this is, you know, maybe some goes back to that implicit bias, is that often, like in a restaurant, as Marsha's talking about, where they do have that mixed seating and they have a requirement to provide accessible seating. So like if they've, you know, got booths or just a mixture or whatever, what I often find is that the accessible seating areas are often placed in some of the least desirable areas of the restaurant. So, you know, I recently went to a bar restaurant situation that had a lot of these high top table types of scenarios and stuff. And they had all of their accessible seating that they were quote unquote required under the standards to have because it was fixed seating was by the kitchen and by the open kind of area of the kitchen with a lot, very noisy, lot of traffic back and forth and things of that nature. And that's a recurring pattern I sometimes see, that, you know, I've got this obligation to ensure that I have these accessible, you know, booths or you know, accessible seating areas when I have fixed built-in seating, but I'm going to put it off in the back. I'm going to put it off to the side. I'm not going to have it as integrated into the other seating areas and such. That's another thing that I see, and I think that's just that people with disabilities, or that seating isn't as desirable from the designer's perspective. I'm not sure, but so I'm going to put it, you know, in one of the least desirable areas of the restaurant from a seating perspective as well.
Well, Robin, this you just raised, you know, a lot of other issues here. Number one, we tend to think of the architects as making these decisions, but they're not. The owner, who is putting together the project, probably determines where that seating is going to be. and they tell the architect, I want a design that includes the seating here and here and here. The people who are checking the plans are not obliged to advise on what's more inclusive. They are checking on whether a certain minimum width is here and there and height is here and there and so on. They're not considering some of the issues that you raised that have to do with inclusion and socialization and so on. So, you know, we've seen plans, beautiful plans done by architects that are truly inclusive in spaces, and yet owners and even builders, how often does the builder go back to the owner and say, look, you want to do this, but I can save you money if we put all this wheelchair stuff over here on this side. And then, you know, there's an extra expense in building it this way. So after the plans are drawn, maybe they've even been through the state checkers and the city checkers and everybody else, the builder will go back and say to the owner, here, let me do it this way. And the owner will nod and it'll be done. And, you know, we have some issues with respect to how you ensure that good plans, well-conceived plans, are actually carried out and completed the way we may have wanted them to be, the way the architects certainly wanted them to be. And I hate to see architects blamed for bad design when the design was done by the owners and the builders.
I think you're absolutely right, Lex. There are many, many players. The owners, the financiers, the builder, all of those players come together. And you're right, we do tend to focus on the architect. What did the architect do wrong? When in many cases, it's the architect being overridden by an owner, and accessibility or inclusion getting, you know, basically chopped in the 11th hour. But I still think that the architect has a role to play, and one that they need to play in terms of being an advocate for the building occupant, an advocate for the person that is going to use the building they're designing.
And Lex, before we had this call, you kind of brought up a very interesting scenario related to new housing. Do you mind sharing that? Because I feel like it's also important, and kind of what Robin was mentioning, that sometimes standards can't keep up.
Yeah, I'm happy to say that I live in Houston, Texas, and we are subject about every 5 years to having a hurricane of huge proportions. And the hurricanes blow up from the Gulf and they blow things down, and they raise the water line and the bios in the city. And the more we build in our city, the more concrete there is. And the more concrete there is, the fewer spaces there are for water to drain into the earth. And we have subsidence and all of these growth issues. And what happens is that people who live in our city, who are accustomed to being flooded every 5 years, begin to rebuild their homes. And sometimes they're encouraged to do so by federal insurance programs and others. And even in our city now, we won't allow homes to be built at grade level in some parts of the city. So what happens? People build new homes, they build whole subdivisions that are made up of houses on stilts like they used to be down by the coast. And how are people who are building these homes going to use them 10, 15 years from now? In my neighborhood, the new homes are being built by by 30 somethings, young people who have burgeoning careers, and they have good income now, and they can afford to build a new home, and they do so on the house across the street from me. I'm watching it going up now, concrete blocks, one story. The garage is under the house, surrounded by concrete blocks, which make up the foundation. And the house, the living level doesn't start until the first floor is up a layer, a whole level above the grade. And the owner of the home proudly said to me the other day, I don't know if she was really thinking straight when she said it, oh my, we have 17 steps leading up to our front door. And I nearly said, that's 17 reasons why I won't be visiting you after you move into your new home. And it's probably
Guess who's not coming to dinner?
it's probably 17 reasons why you won't be able to live in this home in another 15 years. It's probably 17 reasons why your grandchild with a disability won't be coming to see you. And, you know, what is it? People are just not thinking. And why does our community say, you know, you have to build above a certain level, which means you're going to have to raise your home off the grade, without including the provision that you must also provide access to yourselves and your family and your neighbors and emergency service providers and the mailman or whomever else when you build your home up a level above the floodplain. So you know, that's just an issue I'd like to throw out for people to think about. And I think it's, you know, reflective of some of the issues we'll face in the future with climate change in particular.
So we probably have time for one more of our questions, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So please make sure that you write your questions down in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom window. And then Richard will come back on after this last question to try to get to as many as we can. So my last question for the group is, we're witnessing a moment, especially with calls for fighting injustice of marginalized groups, and of course the pandemic, which brought the subject of disability more to people's attention. Disability, however, is still a subject of discomfort and overlooked or not included in these conversations of equity and diversity and inclusion. So how can we as architects and thought leaders, employers and clients, as you were mentioning, Lex, become better allies for the disabled community beyond how we apply the ADA or accessibility standards into our buildings and spaces? Marsha, do you want to answer that?
Sure. I guess I would just say, get to know us. I think that it's there's nothing like familiarity to make it easier for people to set aside their biases or set aside what they think they know about a population. And I think if you know, you are sincere in wanting to understand and wanting to know how somebody with a given disability or several disabilities functions, ask them. You know, of course you have to be polite, but I think most people with disabilities are not shy about saying what we need when we are honestly approached and asked about, you know, how can I accommodate you? How can I make this better for you? I think most of us are quite willing to say how, and so I'd say hang out, get to know us. Remember that friend from college that you know you haven't been in touch with for a while. call them, ask them when you've got a project and you're wondering how you're going to incorporate accessibility for someone who's blind or someone who's low vision or whatever their disability may be. I think that's the key.
Lex or Robin, anything to add to that?
No, I think she said it.
I just want to add, if you see something, say something. You know, if you really want to be an advocate and an ally, and you go to the store and you see somebody who's parked in a spot that's not supposed to be there, just say something. You know, that's all you have to do. If you go out to eat and you see a new shopping center where there's no ramps to the curb, say something. You know, call the code people, call the city, do something. If you really want to be an advocate, figure out how to file a complaint under the ADA, under Title III. Figure out how to file a complaint, you know, or if you live in a city like Houston, call the U.S. Attorney's Office and then sit there and watch. It's a lot of fun to watch these shopping center managers when the U.S. Attorney shows up with these jackets that look like SWAT teams, wearing their badges and carrying their rulers and tape measures. That's really great. They wear the caps, you know, U.S. Attorney's Office, and they show up right at lunchtime when all your customers are there. And in walks 3 people from the U.S. Attorney's Office wearing these badges and caps. And what do your customers think now? Let me tell you, you better get yourself straight because they will shut you down. So, you know, if you see something, say something. Help us out, all right? Be our allies.
And this is, let me just say, Robin, I agree with you totally. And I think, you know, understanding again, because we have people here that are, I guess, I know in Texas, but also from other parts of the country, really understand and know your local laws, know know the community that you're designing and you're working with and what their needs and stuff are. And also, you know, weather has such a huge difference and impact on things, you know, and such. I come from a very snowy, you know, 4 months, 5 months of the year, you know, area and stuff like that and stuff. And you think when you're thinking about your design and you're being an advocate, you know, for us, for people with disabilities and stuff, like think about how weather impacts your design and how it's going to impact, you know, in the worst case scenario of the person who doesn't clear the sidewalk, who doesn't clear the ramp on a regular basis, or the entrance on the regular basis, or the parking lot on a regular basis, or, you know, the doorway, or, you know, whatever else it might be, and, you know, how those things impact and how your design has impact. Because we were talking earlier about the ramp versus the elevator, and I totally agree, you know, with the elevator issue and stuff. I'm sure you advocate because elevators break down and a ramp might be more usable. And I know that, you know, Lex made that argument and stuff that nature. But for some of us in our areas, you know, that when they don't clear the snow and you've got a long ramp area and stuff of that nature that you have to navigate as an option for a good part of the year, that doesn't get cleared until 3 or 4 hours, you know, into the day, you know, and I have to take the train at 7 in the morning, you know, kind of a thing, you know, that is a problem. And so I think, you know, weather does come into your issue. And so think about those things and you know, advocate for those things, and even that design. And I understand, and I agree totally that your owners do drive a lot, but I have worked a lot with architects who have pushed back on the owners wanting to change things and explain to them why they need to do something, why it was better to do something. So I do know it can be done. You know, it's not always just have to acquiesce to the owners what they want, because a lot of times it's you educating that owner about why this design is better and more inclusive, and why you designed it that way. Defend your design.
Absolutely. And I think architects and people who aren't familiar with disability can also just do a little bit of personal responsibility in researching and understanding what language to use, the importance of language, I think is also something that is critical in being an LMA. I think for my questions, I think I'd like to move on to the Q&A. So Richard, do you want to hop back on and maybe try to get some of these questions to our panelists?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ricardo. And here we have some very, very interesting questions. I'll start with this one, and it wasn't directed to any specific guest, but it says, is there a specific section of the ADA/ANSI requirements on the licensing exam for architects, engineers, contractors, building inspectors, et cetera? And if not, why isn't there?
Well, I understand that there is a section on accessibility in the licensing exam. I don't know that it's a huge portion, a big thing. I'd be more concerned about the training than the exam. The exam's just a sample of what you know, and I think it takes more than just memorizing a few things that you know are key to accessibility to really be successfully inclusive. So I would prefer to focus on training young architects to think differently, to think about access, than to demonstrate on an exam that can only sample a few things. And I know the exam is very lengthy and all that, but I guess I just don't put my faith in you know, if somebody came to me and said, I know all about accessibility because I passed the exam, I would say that's unlikely to be true.
If I can interject there, I would say there is value in having these issues on the exam, because many teachers teach to the exam, and more and more school systems are teaching toward the exam. So I would advocate to get as many of these kinds of issues and questions and details into the exam. You know, use your power as members of the association and influencers to get these things on the exam, because the schools will teach to the exam. They, you know, they advertise that 98% of their graduates pass the exam. Well, those graduates have to know the answers to those questions, and the teachers will ensure they get the answers.
But it also goes down to having, this is Robin, having it into the actual curriculum for the accreditation of the program, you know, to even be teaching, I mean, every university, every program has to go through some sort of accreditation process to be, recognized as being able to graduate individuals who have, certain background and meet certain minimum criteria and things of that nature. And, that accreditation process is really critical, I think, important to build that requirement of certain outcomes, into that, certain standards into that education program that is mandated. So then that drives what you teach to also. It's not just teaching to the exam, because they all go hand in hand, right? The education, the accreditation to be able to sit for the exam, et cetera, has to go all together. So I think getting it, into that, and also I think getting more more professors who are, who have themselves embraced inclusivity and accessibility into the classroom, so that they're teaching, so that they're modeling it, so that their students, are, doing projects and things of that nature, and that they're hearing it, and not that it's in one module. I would like to see it and make sure that it's ingrained across the board. So as we're talking about every element, that accessibility is part of that conversation, not separate again. I mean, that's the whole issue when you treat it as separate, and you've got this separate education program or curriculum or whatever requirement. it should be embedded into every conversation, every discussion, just as you know, hopefully are, you know, looking at aging populations, and you're, you know, you're looking at all of the other populations that you're designing for, and the needs for that. That's ingrained in everything, and not just, you know, a single module.
I also think that it's time to recognize that people with disabilities can be designers, can be architects, can be interior designers, can be all kinds of designers, and to encourage participation of people with disabilities as young as elementary school in STEM sciences, as well as in the liberal arts, and encourage those children with disabilities who can not only be architects, but can teach architecture, who you know, can really demonstrate the principles. There are not enough architects with disabilities, and I can name a few, and they're wonderful, but they shouldn't be iconic just, you know, because they're the only 2 or 3 or 4 architects with disabilities you can name. They should be iconic because of the skills they bring forward and the problem solving that they can do in multiple areas, including disability, not just disability. And I think that it's something that we have to really be mindful of at a very early age with our kids,
Hey, Richard.
including our kids with disabilities.
Yeah, Richard, here's a question for you. Does the accreditation board require, do the bylaws, the accreditation board require a certain number of people with disabilities or mobility impaired individuals to be elected to the accreditation board?
Well, that would be the ideal world, Lex. Not to my knowledge, no, not at all. And I think the accreditation boards, as Robin had mentioned, are one of the keys here in terms of giving the option to the university and colleges in terms of how they frame codes and standards and accessible design. Oftentimes, accessible design is part of universal design and might be just a module or 2 out of 16 weeks. And oftentimes the accessibility may also be taught at the same time as learning how to use table 5B of the building code when we're talking about height and area and types of construction. And it's all within a 2-week period of a 16-week course. To my knowledge, there are no mandatory programs that are using the ICC, the IBC, the building code and ANSI, or the 2010 ADA federal standards. And I guess my question to all of you might be, if we were to do that, are we then teaching to the minimums? And is that a good idea? Because what happens is they graduate, they become an intern, and they've had no exposure to these documents. And then projects are held up, permits can't be issued, plans aren't approved, because there's this huge learning curve of the real world. So would you recommend that we begin teaching to those minimum standards, or how do you feel about that?
I strongly recommend that they teach people to appreciate the human body and to appreciate how a human being with a disability will function in a building. And anybody can follow the ADA standards. They're really not rocket science. And it's entirely possible to comply fully with the ADA standards and have a failing building in terms of inclusion and equity. I think we need to focus in on those problem-solving skills that these young people have, and get them to really not just memorize, you know, a standard which they can look up free of charge. It's a matter of really being able to feel how when you put somebody on that incline, they're likely to overbalance if they move a particular way, or to really appreciate that this particular arrangement of items is causing someone with a disability to reach over an obstruction that is now pressing in their side and pushing on their rib cage as they're continuing to try to reach. These are things that people, if they think about it, can figure out very quickly.
I would like to add, I teach in a school where the students leave and create electronic medical records. And we have more than one class. To get a PhD in bioinformatics, you have to take more than one class. So the first class is called Basic, and Basic teaches all of the minimum requirements. And then by the time they get to their later classes, we are teaching design elements that extend well beyond the minimum requirements. So a person who gets a certificate in biomedical informatics will know what the minimum standards are, and they'll be able to design and build and maintain electronic medical records if they have a certificate. But if they're going to get a doctorate, they need to be able to design and build new ideas. They need to take new concepts and incorporate the minimum standards into those inventive ideas. So I would apply that analogy to design architecture, and I would say there's more than one class.
We have an interesting question here that says, how are intersecting identities, disability, race plus gender plus disability, etc., discussed in this field, in your fields? How do those identities and disabilities compound when facing architectural barriers, physical, psychological, socioeconomic, etc.? And how can that intersectional lens lead to more equitable outcomes?
That's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a real tough one. Yeah. I mean, the whole social justice, areas, as we look at, DEIA, in this world that we're in now, and looking at, the fact, I mean, for a long time, it's always been talked about that, disability is the one area of protection that, cuts across all, areas, right? It cuts across age, it cuts across gender, cuts across ethnicity, it crosses, gender. I mean, it's I don't know. It doesn't fit it into a nice, box or anything of that nature. It just anybody at any time, can experience a disability with, coming from any background, everything. So, disability, is in some ways kind of a unifier in that regard, is that because it is one that just cuts across, everything. And that if people understand that and look at that, and, I'm in a disability studies program here at the University of Illinois, and, our students are coming from that whole variety of background, and it's obviously a big focus of the things that we do. And what we've been trying to do is, recruit individuals from across professions, from urban planning, from, education, from, architecture, et cetera, to even, think about coming into some of our coursework and stuff to get a different lens, on what they do and how they do things. And I think just looking at how some of those things could be, built into, what all of us are learning and all of us are talking about and doing on a regular basis, I think, would be very helpful. I don't know if there's one answer to that. I think it really has to be thoughtful. I think it has to be, meaningful and intentional, and not assume that it's just going to happen because you have students of different ethnicity in your programs, or or on your staff, or whatever, or different gender identities, et cetera. I think it's got to be something that we continue to always have this conversation and dialogue around, because look at design. we get questions all the time about, well, what signage should we be using for gender neutral bathrooms? Because people are struggling with, this issue. Do we have to put the wheelchair accessible sign, on the gender neutral bathroom because it's outside of the diagrams that are shown in the standards, and stuff like that. And just like, okay, people think, I mean, what are you doing here? Yes, if it's not accessible, and if it's accessible, you do need to be inclusive of all of those things, and people are going to come from different gender identities and also have a disability, and they're going to come from all different facts of life, and also have a disability, kind of thing. So people just need to be thinking broader and have it as part of conversations, and have those open conversations and honest conversations. I think a lot of people shy away from it because they're uncomfortable. So.
And as part of that
I
question,
think
please go ahead.
Go
Marsha.
ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say to Robin, I think that this is important, an important question because of the fact that we do represent a very broad spectrum of humans and human conditions. And when the discussion of the toilet signs is a perfect way to kind of think about this. Would you have a sign that says gender neutral and another sign on the other toilet that says people with disabilities?
Mm-hmm.
No, because there's an obvious overlap. So I think that this is something that people just have to apply some logic to and really consider. I know in early days with a lot of the gay and lesbian organizations, I had a dear friend who had a very severe disability, and she got very frustrated trying to get the gay and lesbian organizations to think about where they would meet and how they would get together, because they would consistently pick places that weren't accessible to her. And so, this idea of inclusion is not limited to just including people that fall neatly into these various categories of disability or transgender or whatever. We have to broaden our ideas again, and I'll say it one more time. We have to broaden our notion of what is normal. Who is the normal building occupant? It's all of us. It's an amalgam. We are all in the same boat.
And I would remind people could become in that same boat. I mean, again, every one of us, can acquire a disability at any time. It is the one area that is not discriminatory in itself.
Good point. There are two questions that talk about code minimum requirements and strategies, technological or simply good design, that may be more innovative and also help educate builders and designers. I will throw out one quick strategy, and that is the removal of doors. We see quite a bit in public buildings now. Airports are a good example, where you will have a privacy screen and no longer have a door leading to that bathroom. And there's a huge savings in not only the door itself, but in long-term maintenance, sanitation, et cetera. Are other suggestions that that the panel may have about strategies that may be not part of the code minimum, but may be able to apply some logic and even perhaps cost savings, as with the door example?
I think Lex and Robin, I keep putting the R on the wrong name. Lex and Robin both alluded to this earlier. There's this choice between a ramp and a stair. No, there's a third choice out there. And that's the truly inclusive answer, which is no ramp and no stair. I think we have to challenge ourselves once again to go beyond the standards. Yes, the standards will be happy if you put in a ramp or you put in an elevator, but that's not inclusive design. It's not universal design. Universal design is level entry for everybody.
Here's an interesting one. I work for a town with lots of historic buildings and streets. We do a lot of retrofits to make our community more accessible and often have to meet ADA to the maximum extent feasible. So they're talking about maybe technical infeasibility because it's an existing building and it's historic. How can we better evaluate what to prioritize if we can't meet all the standards?
I mean, this is Robin. I always say, who are your users? Who's your audience? Who, going back to the, anytime you have to prioritize, I always get frustrated when the prioritization takes place internally and doesn't look externally to those that are actually the users of your space and those that are your citizens, your community, et cetera, should be helping you with prioritization of those things. When they understand that there are constraints and things of that nature, they're going to be willing to come to the table and talk to you about what are most important to us. What are the things that we can give, or a little bit on here or whatever, if we can get this, or such. I really think it's important to understand who use your community as part of your prioritization process and your users. What are you most frequently visited? What are your most frequently used? What are features and things of that nature, so that you're prioritizing those things that are of most importance to people and that are used the most.
And as we're nearing the end of the webinar here, I've been asked to remind everyone, all of the participants, to please look at the chat for a feedback survey. So we certainly want to hear your feedback. And also this is where you would provide your name and AIA licensing or registration number for the continuing education credits. So just a reminder to everyone. And maybe we have one more time for one more question. I'm currently in an architectural program, and I often come across resistance to including more than the standards in the code in our instruction. Innovative emergency exits for wheelchair users is a concern, but draws no interest. The ADA in 1990 did a lot, but somehow still allows different space types to exist without accommodations, especially in housing. Do you think another bill is needed to close these gaps?
I think that HUD needs to revisit their fair housing accessibility guidelines, which are archaic. And they need to do that with a federal advisory committee that includes representation from all stakeholders. I think housing is the worst of our problems. I think that the Fair Housing Act really didn't accomplish what we expected it to accomplish in terms of design.
I would like to add that the fastest growing demographic in the United States are people of retirement age.
Aging.
As people get older, they become disabled. That's a fact. And as they become disabled, they need accommodations. If we don't plan for that segment of the population, we're going to have a crisis in America, because there are not enough caregivers, there are not enough institutions where people can live when they are disabled. There are not enough assisted living apartments. There are not people want to age in place, and they want to be in the community. They want to be in their own homes. The way they can be so is if their homes can accommodate them, if they're built to accommodate disabilities, if they're built to make them functional in a space. And if we don't regulate that somehow, people simply aren't foresightful enough to take care of themselves. So I think it's up to we as the public and as public authorities that have to represent us to look after us and provide some kinds of guidance in the rules. And that's just my thought.
Yeah, housing's the toughest one because, and as we've seen bills and things of that nature that have been attempted on visitability and other kinds of things, there's such a strong pushback from the Home Builders Association and other groups of that nature because they see it as infringing upon an individual's rights versus a building or a commercial construction, et cetera, which is viewed differently, in regards to how it impacts or who's paying for it or its responsibility, to be compliant with these kinds of things. And I just think we just have to change the mindset of society more that these things that we're doing now are going to benefit everybody later, benefit you later when you're older, or benefit you should your family member become disabled. You don't have to be displaced from your home because you can't you can't adjust your current home to meet the needs of a family member or yourself that has a disability. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, the other thing I would
I
add,
think we also,
I'd like to add also that the people on this call are smart people. They are people committed to their trade, and they're people who understand that we are a society and we all have to live together. And that includes making the whole environment accessible, not just the spaces that they're designing for. So I encourage all of you to run for public office, to be appointed to boards and commissions, get to know the mayor, and become appointees to the boards and commissions in the cities and towns that are making up these rules, and then we can fix it. And I think that people, I think your own organizations need to change your bylaws and ensure that there are a representation on your own organizations of people with disabilities and people with mobility impairments. And you need not to be strictly concerned about the spaces you're designing, but they have to fit into a whole community. So you need to be concerned about the sidewalks and the streets and the public transportation. All of that needs to fit into a community that we can all be proud of, happy in, we can have high quality of life, and so it goes.
If I just say one thing, really strongly encourage you to connect with your community and find out who the organizations and groups are in your community that serve people with disabilities, that are, that have people with disabilities on their staff and stuff, and connect with them and across disability, whether that be independent living centers, that be organizations specifically, working with certain types of disabilities, et cetera, to really reach out and connect with them for feedback and for education. They could help educate you about some of their issues and their needs, and give you feedback on that.
also think about what you would want when and if you become a person with a disability, and hopefully you will, because we want you all to live long. And one of the prices of living long is, as Lex said, you acquire some disability. And so, we all have to be willing to put our money where our mouth is. We all have to be demanding from the housing market features in our homes that allow us to live there longer and more independently, even if we don't need them right now.
And I'll have to bring up that our interpreters and captioners have to drop off now. We're at our time limit.
Yes, unfortunately, we are out of time, and I do want to thank our panelists and thank you for your time and space to be here and to share your thoughts and experiences with us. And thank you to the audience for tuning in and taking this necessary step in learning about all these very important topics. This hopefully isn't the last of these kinds of webinars. And thank you again. I hope to see you guys soon. Bye, everyone.